You're listening to a Life in Quebec podcast. For more, visit lifeinquebec.com.
I'm Andrew Greenfield from lifeinquebec.com and welcome to another edition of Election Perspectives. It's week 6 of the 2015 Canadian federal election campaign and we're joined again by Colin Standish, a former Liberal Party prospective candidate for the Compton-Stanstead riding in the eastern townships of Quebec. Colin, welcome and thanks for being with us again.
Thanks so much for having me here, Andrew.
So week 6, just over halfway into the 11-week marathon. The three major parties are all claiming leads, they're all claiming to have the best policies, to have what it takes, and they're all calling out their rivals. Who are we supposed to believe come election day on Monday the 19th of October?
Yeah, that's certainly $1 million question. So, it really is still a three-way race, and that's become one of the stories of the campaign, but we're seeing the Conservatives drop down to, I believe, about 26% in the polls last week. You saw the NDP 31-32. You saw the Liberals briefly on top, but they're at about 30%. Now I think it's really about 30-30-30 for all the polls are predicting. And the seat polls are interesting because, you know what, percentages don't necessarily tell us how parties are going to win. For example, that in Quebec, the NDP is almost at 50% in the polls, give or take. So to look at the polls and say, well, they have 30% of Canadians' votes across the country. Well, if it's regionally concentrated, having 50% of votes in Compton-Stanstead and then only having 10% of the votes in Toronto Centre, for example, for the NDP, it doesn't translate into actual seats sometimes, right? So that's important to keep in mind. But the NDP is actually projected to win 115 seats. The Conservatives are actually projected to win 113, the Liberals 109. So those are the seat counts looking at the data on individual ridings. So it's actually a three-way race when you get down into the nitty-gritty of it. So who to believe on October 1st? Well, we're going to have to wait in and tune into that. And I think after Labor Day now, I think Canadians are going to start to tune in a lot more. The weather's changing. The leaves are starting to turn color and fall off the trees. So I think you're going to see Canadians tune in a lot more to the election. And that's going to see, you could see big changes in the polls coming up, in my opinion.
So we're slightly over a month to go to the 19th of October, the big day. Why do you think the NDP are so popular in Quebec?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question because they've actually seemed to have become more popular. I think they had around 40% of the vote, 41% in the last election. Now they're polling up to 47, 50%. In my home riding in Compton-Stanstead, they're at 52.2% in the polls today. That's insane. So, you know what? I think they've done a very good job on some things, looking at it objectively. Even though I'm a former Liberal and have butted heads with NDP supporters and candidates, respectfully, of course. But you know what Jack Layton said to his new MPs? He said, make sure you're visible in your constituencies. So these guys are going to every event in little local ridings. I see my NDP MPs out at different ones in the ridings in the eastern townships in the last year. So they're very visible. People are meeting them and greeting them. Generally, nice people, concerned about their communities. Obviously, I think that goes for any legislator. There's not, I don't think there's bad people in politics, despite sometimes what we see in the news. People are there for the right reasons, in my experience, and it's been, and that's been over a decade in politics now. So I think they're very visible in their ridings. There's not been major flubs, or there've been sometimes the ones that are made aren't reported about, but you've seen two Conservative candidates turfed in the past week. You have seen minor scandals that I think the NDP really did weed out a lot of their weaker candidates in nomination races. They weren't talked about, but there were MPs who were sort of silently shuffled to the side. Some of them actually switched parties to the Bloc or the Liberals. So you kind of saw a weeding out of the weaker MPs, NDP MPs. And then the ones that are there really haven't made many missteps. You haven't seen a lot of foot in the mouth from either Thomas Mulcair or his MP. So kudos on that.
Yeah.
I think, though, there's a lack of ground support, though. Fundraising is sometimes only was $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. I raise more than this for my campaign, just for a nomination race. So they really don't have the resources on the ground to mobilize that, to give it traction. But, the polls are standing fast, and they were able to turn it out in 2011. So it'll be interesting to watch.
So how much then? I mean, you mentioned in your answer a couple of moments ago you mentioned Jack Layton. I mean, as sad as it is for Canadian politics and as sad as it is for NDP supporters, he's long gone, but he's still revered, isn't he?
Yes, almost certainly. Yeah, but I remember there was a guy in Chicoutimi, I think 2 years ago. He said, about the NDP. He's like, it's like the Penguins without Crosby and something like this. It's like a team, it's a team without their captain or their leader. And that's sort of the perception amongst Quebecers. But you know what? Mr. Mulcair, despite concerns I have about public policy with him. He's done a good job at sort of having a steady hand on the wheel of the ship, but he's not sort of the exciting, charismatic leader that Mr. Layton was. I don't think he's attracted as much attention. But he was in Quebec politics. He was an environment minister for many years. So I think he was 15 years in the National Assembly. So the reverence of Jack Layton, it still persists. But that people did vote for Jack Layton last time, that they didn't usually know who their candidates were in their ridings. But Mr. Mulcair has been a steady hand on the wheel, but he hasn't attracted that sort of that love that Mr. Layton did, it seems.
Well, we'll see what happens there with just over a month to go. So the Conservative campaign, they've hired a guy called Lynton Crosby, an Australian election specialist nicknamed the Wizard of Oz. It's for his ability to use vote-splitting tactics to benefit his employers. Now, this is a very controversial move, particularly since Crosby is known to advocate for tactics of scaring voters against immigration and crime, two huge topics. Is this, as some are saying, a desperation tactic on the part of the Conservative government?
I would say so, yeah. No, I would certainly agree with that assessment. I don't think this election has gone as Mr. Harper planned necessarily. There's been two flubs on behalf of the candidates. There's an interesting article in the Globe and Mail today just about, the Conservatives have lost the message. They're not as in tightly control as you've seen. That they're usually a party that really wants to control the message. But it's interesting on the economy as well. You haven't heard much from our actual Minister of Finance, Joe Oliver, who was a candidate in Eglinton Lawrence in Toronto, and you haven't heard much from Mr. Harper's the point man on the economy. This has been part of the, I think, problem with the Harper regime, is that he hasn't cultivated good leaders behind him. He did certainly have an A-team behind him. He had Jim Prentice, he had Jim Flaherty, he had Mr. McKay as well. So, and he certainly has, and then John Moore, I believe, resigned. So you had these people, these star players that actually are not there for the 2011 election. And as well, he is now the front man on the economy. So I think, to a certain extent, he should have star ministers, but I don't feel Mr. Harper has cultivated leaders under him. He's been very, I would say, narcissistic in the way he rules. And that's something that's a bad sign of leadership. When you're not cultivating other leaders, that's a bad leader. So I think that he's putting himself too front and center, and people are tired of the Harper regime. So instead of actually putting other point men on key portfolios and issues, he has people like Christopher Alexander who have actually galvanized people against the Conservative government with the stance on Syria and the waffling on the refugee crisis there. So I think that's so it's interesting. Mr. Harper's put himself front and center, has not cultivated other people in his cabinet, and when they have in this election, they botch the message like Mr. Alexander.
Well, we'll see on the 19th whether people have had enough of Mr. Harper when people go to the polls. Now, in Quebec, the FTQ, the union, the Fédération des Travailleurs et Travailleuses du Québec, they've made a big splash in announcing support for ABC, basically anyone but Harper, pledging support for 5 NDP candidates in the Quebec City region. Surprisingly, they're also backing a Liberal candidate in Montreal. For the first time in its history, the FTQ is promising to lend its support directly to canvassing and getting out there and getting out the vote. Now, how much of an impact could this have in Quebec province, do you think?
Yeah, no, it is fascinating to watch, and it's in the labor movement. It's been much maligned in that it's actual it's usually historically been associated in Quebec with the Bloc Québécois or the PQ, and then the NDP has sort of usurped that to a certain extent. That obviously they have a real connection with Labour in the rest of Canada. But Labour is a unifying force, as I'm sure you know, many of our readers know, is not the salient force it was a generation or two ago. Then when you get to private sector employment, I mean, it's just barely double digit, right? I think it's, maybe 19% of employees in the public sector in Canada, or private sector in Canada, are unionized. I haven't seen the numbers for a few years, to be honest, but I studied in political science at Queen's University. So it's interesting to see them mobilize that. But no, they do have the numbers that they're looking hard at. If they can get 5,000 to 10,000 people out in certain ridings to vote a certain way, that's going to shift races. So no, I think they have 600,000 members in Quebec, and that they're targeting races. I think this could have a real impact. Organizational structure, they are organized, and then as well, if you can mobilize 5,000 to 10,000 votes in key ridings, you're going to win.
It's a big if to do that, but it's certainly it's going to put somebody in a seat, isn't it? If they can get it right.
I agree totally. No, it's a fascinating thing to watch, and we'll see how how is that going to work between nice Labour that's been very independent of necessarily certainly NDP political parties. How are they going to work with them on the ground, where unconstitutional. Like I was saying, there's little actual support for the NDP on the ground. So will this really benefit the NDP to sort of supercharge certain campaigns, or will it be an awkward marriage, right? It remains to be seen. So it'll be quite fascinating.
Well, I'm looking forward to looking at how that one pans out, actually. I want to go back to talking about polls again. We mentioned that at the start of the conversation. But it seems that every day we get a new poll and a new party's in first place. How are voters supposed to read these wildly varying polls? Who are we supposed to believe, Colin?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Andrew. You articulated so well. Who are we supposed to believe in this election? Certainly when it comes to policies, it's a question up in the air. But the polls, they seem to be accurate. That you see, the aggregate polls, and there's Eric Grenier, who has a poll tracker at CBC. Once I think I've told your viewers about it before. Go there. As well, there's 308.com. That's Eric Grenier as well. Listen to Nick Nanos as well. Has a big polling firm. So listen to these guys. But I think the numbers are accurate and true. However, it's hard. I wouldn't say wild swings, but you see it's sort of a seesaw, or that people are just sort of riding back and forth on 2 to 3%. And I think voters might tune that out to a certain extent. That it's a three-way race, and no one's really able to give us the interpretation on who has momentum or not. Except that Harper might be sinking, the NDP might be entrenching in Quebec, and the Liberals are probably doing better in the Maritimes and Ontario than anyone expected.
Well, come October the 19th, two parties are going to get a massive shock, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, we do know one thing. Yeah, no, but it looks like it's a minority government. I think that's something that the talk of the coalition hasn't been as intense this time as in 2011 or 2008, and it was really shameful. I thought with Mr. Harper, he tried to bill it as unconstitutional, but of course it's the will of the House of Commons. If most MPs want to vote a certain way, that's the government, right?
Yeah.
So political parties are social constructions. The Prime Minister, look at our Constitution. He's not mentioned there. There's no mention of a Prime Minister. It's by convention, right? It's political tradition that has led to these things. So if members of Parliament we elect suddenly decided, hey, we want to do it a different way, and it was constitutional, why not, right? So
yeah.
I think we will see an interesting thing with a minority situation where the NDP or the Liberals are going to have to prove themselves worthy of governing. Or if the Conservatives have a minority government, well, I think Harper's days are certainly numbered, but will he resign immediately will be an interesting question.
Do you think we'll see a coalition?
I don't. I think Mr. Harper, I think it's going to come down to a variety of factors, but I think Mr. Trudeau has certainly said we won't have a formal coalition. So what I think I would see is you'd have, whoever it would be, Liberals or NDP or Conservatives. I don't think the Conservatives could ever get a coalition partner. The Liberals and NDP simply wouldn't do it. Could the NDP and Liberals do it themselves? I think Mr. Trudeau certainly has seen incompatibility on the economy and also the question of national unity with the NDP. So I think they could have an agreement to vote on confidence motions, right? Like the like budgets, etc., just to make sure the government keeps afloat, and then disagree with each other on everything else, perhaps. So I think you could see not a formal coalition, but an agreement on confidence motions for a year or 18 months, or at least until the other party signals to the other that it's over. I think that's the likely scenario. But I think we're all looking. You know what I think, Andrew? We're looking at a new prime minister on October 19th, because it doesn't look like Harper's going to win a majority, and if he doesn't, his days are numbered, literally hours into that election. He will not be Prime Minister.
Well, let's see. Again, it's a brave prediction, Colin, but let's see. In a recent CBC interview with Peter Mansbridge, NDP leader Thomas Mulcair said he'd pull all Canadian troops out of Iraq and stop involvement there if he became Prime Minister. Should he do that?
I'm not of the opinion of the term used sometimes is cut and run. I mean, that's not the solution, and I think we don't have that many troops in Iraq. It's more that our Air Force is, I guess, the one that's most involved. So I think dating from, I think it is June. It's interesting. I recommend Canadians check this out, that I just did this today to prepare for the interview, is that there's Operation Impact is the name, if Canadians didn't know that. Impact is the name of our mission overseas right now in Syria and Iraq. And as well, we've had about 1,000 sorties, so actually, different airplanes going out and doing missions, whether reconnaissance or bombing. And we've had about 100 actual, bombing missions actually seen through to completion. So that's pretty significant. But boots on the ground, there's not so many, but we are making a significant air contribution. So do I think it's effective for public policy to pull out? No, I think sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't, always in some areas of the world. But the problem with ISIL and ISIS is you have this militant terrorist jihadist movement that's broken down the Sykes-Picot borders that were established after World War I in the Middle East, and it's a terrifying situation. So I think Canada's doing the responsible thing, though I'm not usually for foreign military interventions. I think Canada's intervention right now is appropriate. I think it's measured. I think it's balanced. And I think to actually pull back on that is not the right solution.
I mean, there are troops on the ground there too. I mean, they're not fighting; they're in a training mission. Now, the terrorists from that region, are they not a threat here in Canada too? So, should we be involved in overseas?
I mean, obviously, terrorism and overseas calamities, they will eventually wash up on our shores. That we can't tune out from the rest of the world, but I don't think I'm not of the, one must always be prudent. We saw two incidents of homegrown terrorism last year. We saw two military men. There was one, the incident with Ziha Bibo in Ottawa last year, and also the ones at Saint Jean-sur-Richelieu, I think, shocked the country. Right? These were obscene attacks on members of our military by terrorists, here in this country, and actually stormed Parliament Hill. One man. It was terrifying. So these things do wash up on our shores, but I think Canadians have far graver concerns about homegrown terrorism and other issues closer to home than we really have to care about Syria and Iraq and what's going on there coming to Canada. I'm not of the opinion that's going to be an immediate impact here. So no, I give no reservations that we need to care about the world and it will eventually show up. But is this an immediate concern for Canadians? No, I don't think so.
No, fair enough. I want to touch back onto things in Quebec province now and relating to the federal election. Now, the Bloc Québécois, they're obviously active in Quebec province. Gilles Ducep's back as leader. One thing I've noticed here in the province is that they've recently changed the slogans on their election signs. They now say "On a tout à gagner." So, why do you think they've changed the slogans, and is it worth doing?
Yeah, no, that's a great observation, and that's been talked about a lot in political circles in Quebec, and that's a sign of desperation. I think the Bloc Québécois now, if you look at the polls, they might have 0 seats in the coming election. I drove past this is interesting, Gilles Ducep's campaign office last week, and he had his big bus outside, etc. So he's actually in his home riding right now because it looks like he's actually set to lose. I think it's Saint Laurent he has in Montreal. He's set to lose that, so he was having a campaign in his home riding. So that's not a very good sign for them. So I think to change their slogans and also to make it less nationalist and make it more about, hey, Quebec can get what it wants at its federal table. They really in 2004 they really had a big breakthrough right after the Gomery Commission saying, you know what, it's about being Quebecers and we were taken advantage of. Let's speak for Quebec. It's a very seductive argumentation, right? But it doesn't seem to connect with Quebecers. So I think it's a sign of desperation. And so I'm not of the opinion it's going to work in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. Well, a couple of final questions because we're nearly out of time. Has anything quirky or funny caught your eye this week? Come on, we've got just over a month to go. We it's a long slog. We need something. We need a bit of humour. Have you seen anything?
I'll tell you one thing that caught my eye. I'm not sure if it fits into humor though. Is Jean Chrétien coming back on the campaign trail to give a shellacking to the NDP on the question of the Clarity Act and national unity? So to see Chrétien back in the game, he's very avuncular. He's everyone's he's everyone's grandfather at Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner with his stories. So check out some of the articles about them that he was on the front page of the Globe and Mail, or at least their online editions today. So it's interesting that people are starting to question the NDP on the national unity issue. Not sure if it's funny, but seeing Chrétien back in the game, to see it when they drag out old leaders from the Liberal Party is not something I normally recommend. But you know what? Martin on the economy, Chrétien on national unity, these men are legendary, right? And they've been called back to speak on those issues. So I think the Liberal Party's done well on that. Not sure how humorous it is. I think for people perhaps to check, if they want to see humor, to check out, obviously it's a bit inappropriate to a certain extent, but to see the Conservative candidate in the Toronto area who was turfed for, I believe, peeing into a cup. That's sort of, if anyone wants to check that out, it might provide a little bit of amusement in your day. And also the Harperman video to check out the podcast, Life in Quebec did about it last week, but that's certainly making the rounds still. So I'd recommend people check that out as well for a little amusement here on the campaign trail. Okay,
good. Now, final question then. Months ago, this final month of the campaign, what can we expect to see?
Yeah, we're in the slog where I think you're going to see several things. You're going to see, firstly, Canadians are going to tune in more. The weather's changing. It's after Labor Day, so the sort of summer party mode has died down. People are going to tune in a bit more. Secondly, you're going to see parties start to get a little bit more desperate, or maybe desperate is not the right word. They're going to start fighting, more extremely for votes. Right? We're just over a month away from the final voting day. We're in a 3-year race. What are they going to do to differentiate themselves? I think so you're going to see differentiation. You're going to see new tactics come out, new advertising. This is where you could see either they're going to hit the ground running, that it's going to connect with Canadians in a big way, or they can make flubs. So if you have the wrong policy, the wrong advertisement, you attack Justin Trudeau in the wrong way, for example, it could really turn Canadians off. Or in the next debates, it's hard to sort of follow the debates because Harper sort of pulled out of the consortium debates, and then as well, I believe the next one is the Globe and Mail, largely focus on foreign policy debate that all the leaders will be at. But to see whether there's really the knockout punch, like we saw with Mulroney versus Turner, that we hardly remember a week before that in 1984, if I recall correctly, that Mulroney had a very actually offensive quote about patronage, and then he turned around and it made it look like he saw it, that he didn't see a problem with it, and then he turned around, he gave a shellacking to Turner on that in that debate. And it just as well, we saw Layton that to Ignatieff in 2011 on his turnout on voting record in the House of Commons. So whether we'll see anything connects or we'll see some real flops, and so that's going to be very interesting to see. So new strategies from the party. Will it connect with Canadians? Will there be flops? And thirdly, who's going to mobilize their core constituencies? And I think the NDP, by sort of saying, we're not going to run deficits, we'll do this, and that, and then the numbers maybe don't add up, and then as well the Liberal Party saying, we're going to go into deficit spending for infrastructure. I think that the NDP might have actually made a big flop there because you might alienate your core constituency, though of course they're trying to alleviate concerns that maybe they'll be spending too much and they're socialists, etc. I think actually when you start alienating your base, when you turn away from your base to try and eat people's lunch in politics, you're going to see that you're actually going to lose your votes, and you might actually lose the message, and people don't know where to place you anymore on the spectrum. So I think that's one thing to watch. The NDP in particular moved away from their base too much to actually to win this election, or at least have significant impact.
Okay, Colin, we're out of time again this week. As ever, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Andrew. A pleasure to be here as always.
And to you at home or work, thanks again for listening to Election Perspectives from lifeinquebec.com.
Thank you for listening to a Life in Quebec podcast. For more news, editorials, and opinion, visit lifeinquebec.com.